Okay, this is the second lecture on the carbon cycle. And it's based on pages 154 to 158 and 161 to 164 from the reading. Same reading as last time, Kampadal, chapter 8. Okay, so we're going to start today by talking about the short-term marine carbon cycle. So last time we talked about the land. Now we're going to talk about the oceans. And one of the first things to know here is that gases, so why does it matter what's going on in the ocean? Well, one of the reasons is that gas is exchanged freely between the atmosphere and the ocean. So and the main process here where that happens is diffusion. So basically, there's some kind of there's the water. This is the water and the air. Okay, there's some kind of concentration of gas, obviously, in the air, and there's always going to be an exchange between, if you put a bunch of any kind of gas in the air, it's going to diffuse and end up some of it in the water. So there won't necessarily be the same concentrations, but there's some kind of equilibrium where there's a proportion of amount of air, let's say nitrogen gas in the air versus nitrogen gas in the water. And it's a thermodynamic, there's some kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, and the molecules basically just, are bouncing around, and they will enter the water or leave the water by diffusion, and we may talk about that further later in the class. So CO2 gets in the atmosphere. It ends up entering the ocean. If we put extra CO2 in the air, some of that's going to go in the water. So that's a big part of the carbon cycle. So we're going to start by talking about some of the key organisms. Got to start somewhere. And so phytoplankton is sort of the base of the food chain. So it's a good place to start. Phytoplankton. And these are mainly a thing called a diatom, mainly diatoms, which is a kind of algae and other algae. So these things actually produce more oxygen than plants on land, so they're really important. This is the dominant primary producer in the ocean. And because they're performing photosynthesis, so they're kind of the equivalent of plants they serve the role as plants, but they float around, and they live in the surface ocean because that's where the light is. So we call this, specifically where they live, the photic zone, which is depending on where you are, this range can vary, but something like the upper 100 meters. In other words, where light penetrates. So if you're near a coast, the water would tend to be more muddy, so that the photic zone will be less deep, but out away from the sources of sediments, it could be deeper than this. And where do they get their CO2 to perform photosynthesis? It's the dissolved CO2 in the water. So they consume dissolved CO2 and they produce oxygen like all photosynthesizers. And they're most common at high latitudes. And the reason for that is they need, in order to do their work, they need nitrogen and phosphorus. So these are important nutrients, and oftentimes they're upwelling at high latitudes, and so that's where most phytoplankton can be found. But they can be found all over the place, in rivers and lakes, and in smaller numbers. Okay, so they're the base of the food chain in the ocean, and they get eaten up by zooplankton. So these are free-floating marine consumers. And just some popular ones: foraminifera, radiolarians, so at this point, it should be clear to you that, when we say consumers, we're implying they're eating the primary producers. These are kind of like these sort of sciencey terms that we're using here. So they eat phytoplankton and each other, but the phytoplankton is the sort of the source of their energy. They produce CO2 like all consumers. They also produce, they poop. They produce nutrient-rich fecal pellets. And these settle to the ocean floor, or they settle down. So they settle to, a lot of them don't make it to the ocean floor because they're nutrient-rich. Or they can decompose while settling. Which has the effect of producing CO2 throughout the water column. So we'll talk more about that in a second. But if you're having trouble, these should be fairly easy to remember, because zoa looks like zoo, right? It's coming from the same root. It's the animals, basically. And the phyto is having to do with light. So those are easy to remember. And so this process of the existence of the zooplankton and the fecal pellets that are kind of raining down from near the surface of the ocean, that carries CO2 down into deep levels of the ocean. So that's one of the key things here. So we're gonna talk about next, like how the different mechanisms whereby carbon moves around. So we talked about diffusion earlier already, briefly. And what we just described is called the biological pump. And this term, you see it a lot. And it's what we just described. It's the movement of CO2 and nutrients from the surface to deep water. And that's by the processes we just described. So it's driven by gravity, the dense fecal pellets raining down, and it's pretty significant. So without it, the surface ocean would be twice as acidic as it is, which would quickly dissolve coral reefs and most, not all, organisms with shells, with carbonate shells. So basically the carbon, right? So we have the water, we have the air again, the water. So the carbon dissolves into the water by diffusion. The phytoplankton use it, incorporate it into their bodies. They're eaten by zooplankton. The zooplankton poop or die, and gravity sends them down. So CO2 is just kind of moving down into the column of water. So if that process stopped, there's a lot of CO2 that would be built up there. And I think this term pump is to me it's a little confusing. I think of a water pump bringing water up, right? Up towards the surface. But in this case, we're talking about CO2 being pumped down. So pumping doesn't necessarily mean a direction, but for me at least, it's been getting my mind around this. Oh, actually, we're talking about some CO2 moving down when we talk about the biological pump. So another important flux mechanism, and we may come back. I've previously spent like a week or two talking about diffusion of different things, so we might come back to that later in the class in more detail. So I mentioned earlier the location where phytoplankton prefer being places where there's these nutrients that are being carried up. So that process where deeper ocean water is coming up is called upwelling. And that upwelling returns nutrients and CO2 to the surface. And there's different sort of reasons upwelling might occur. But one reason it doesn't, if you think about, oftentimes the surface water will be warmed by the sun. So the surface water will tend to be warmer and the deeper water colder. And so there's a density difference, right? The warm water will be less dense. And so there's a tendency for the surface water to sort of stay near the surface and the colder water or the colder or deeper water to stay deeper levels. So more often than not, that's what happens. So it's where upwelling, or we'll talk about downwelling in a bit. So where that occurs, it's noteworthy. So the wind can help cause that. The wind, if you have some water and the wind, blows a bunch of it out of the way, that the water is carried, and so that part of that motion of the water is, and water from deeper levels will come up to replace the water that's been blown away by the wind. So the wind is important for this. And something called thermohaline circulation. So temperature, right, in the thermo, and haline having to do with the salinity. So in the ocean, of course, the density isn't controlled only by warm and cold, but also by the presence of salt in the water. That'll make it more dense. So temperature and salinity affect density. And thermohaline circulation, so these two things control where upwelling occurs. Yeah, and just a reminder, let's talk about density for a moment here. Sort of like a sidebar density. Okay, so molecules molecules are bouncing around, right? Bouncing into each other. And the warmer the temperature, the faster they're moving, right? So they're bouncing harder into each other, and they push against each other harder. So when it's hotter, it's less dense. Similarly, if we add like some sodium and chlorine ions, they can take up more space. So, you get more stuff into the same volume, which increases the density. So these are the reasons that the temperature and the salinity affect density. And the density is what controls the water is going to move in a way so that the denser stuff is lower. So I mentioned this, but we'll write it down here. So phytoplankton need nutrients from upwelling. And where are the nutrients coming from? It's this stuff. It's the nitrogen and the phosphorus that are associated with all this fecal matter and the decomposition of the plankton that have sunk down in the ocean. So some places the biological pump is sending this material down, and then it's the cold, deep water of the ocean tends to be rich in these nutrients. So then where it comes up is places that the phytoplankton can prosper. Okay, so we just talked about if we go back up here, actually let's put up here so let's distinguish between organic and inorganic. Here we did this for the land, we should do it here as well. So of course the processes involving the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, this would be organic. Organic carbon cycle. Same with the biological pump. Organic. And then diffusion and upwelling, inorganic. So let's talk a little bit more next about inorganic. In the ocean. And some of this applies to freshwater as well. CO2 dissolves easily in water. And as I mentioned, it's exchanged between the atmosphere and ocean. By diffusion. And diffusion follows concentration gradients. So an example of this would be cutting an onion. Those molecules, it's the process where the onion molecules in the air are just kind of bouncing around, and there's more over in the corner where you cut it at first, but then they slowly spread out throughout the room into following the concentration gradient. So at first there's a large gradient right where the onion's cut, but it moves sort of down to where the onion particles in the air move away from where they're concentrated, right? So CO2 enters the ocean, the places where phytoplankton use CO2 up. So at the high latitudes. Okay, so that makes sense, right? If there's some kind of, here we are with the air, and the water, the sea. Let's say we start at some kind of equilibrium, right? But then if the phytoplankton in the water are taking the CO2 out of the water and turning it, I mean, it's still in the water, but they're turning it into their bodies. So the concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide in the water goes down, so that sends CO2 from the air into the sea. And so the opposite happens as well. CO2 tends to exit the ocean, where upwelling occurs. This is often near equators, not always. They're near the equator. We only have one. Right, because let's see if we draw a little globe here, the equator. Okay, so CO2 sinks, basically. Carbon enters the ocean at the high latitudes, more often than not, and then the water tends to be upwelling closer to the equators in general, and there's lots of variations around this, but so in order for not to lose all the carbon that we have in the atmosphere, if we're sinking it down into the ocean, it's got to come back, right? So that's where it comes back up, and at that point, the CO2 will have the opposite sign. It'll be coming out of the water into the air. So the oceans can therefore be, depending where and when, the oceans can be a source or a sink for CO2. However, pretty much what we've been talking about, I haven't really talked too much about the human effects on the carbon cycle yet. We'll get to that. So up until a couple hundred years ago, there was a relative balance, right, between the carbon dioxide going in and coming out. But these days, since we're putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere, the ocean is the major sink. For carbon dioxide. Similar amount of the carbon dioxide that's been released into the air from burning fossil fuels, something like half of it is ended up in the water. Okay, so we've talked about water moving upward, upwelling. The opposite process is called deep water formation. So we talked about carbon dioxide moving down via the biological pump, but that wasn't actually the water moving down, right? It was just carbon-rich material moving down. So the water itself can move down. We call that deep water formation, and that's sort of the opposite of upwelling, or the counterpart. And dense water sinks. So it's driven by density, and that happens different places, but the majority of it is in the North Atlantic. For reasons that I don't fully understand. But it involves the seawater being cooled by cold winds. Okay, so remember, cooling it down will make the water denser. And there's also significant evaporation in the formation of ice. So both of those things make the water denser that's left. So these things increase density. So why does evaporation, ice formation increase the density? It's because it's salty water. So evaporation removes just the H and the hydrogen and the oxygen. It leaves behind the salt particles, so that makes the water denser. Same with ice. And so this deep water formation, especially in the North Atlantic, sends a lot of CO2 down into the deep water where it's sort of being collected. And I'll show a slide about that here in a few minutes. So let's summarize these different fluxes and sinks, or we could say stocks and flows, right? So let's start with the atmosphere, because we talked about that before. So we'll draw another one of these diagrams, put some numbers on it. So we learned last time that the atmosphere has around 760 gigatons of CO2 in it. And we've been talking about this process of diffusion, whereby the CO2 can move in and out of the shallow ocean. And the rates here are so around, let's draw the one down first. So the process that's happening is diffusion. In diffusion, happens over, it's relatively slow and occurs over relatively small distances. So it's not, the time it would take to diffuse surface water with all the way down to the base of the ocean is really long. So that's why it's the mass of water moving that we talked about, the upwelling and the downwelling. But near the surface, it's diffusion. So about 70 gigatons per year are moving from the atmosphere into the ocean. And again, this is pre-industrial. Oceanic carbon cycle. Oops, and I spelled cycle wrong. Okay. So pre-industrial times, these numbers were relatively balanced. Okay, and so we talked about how primary producers in the ocean are photosynthesizing the phytoplankton. So there's a process, photosynthesis, whereby quite a lot, around 50 gigatons per year of CO2 is moving into marine organisms, marine biota, which isn't a huge reservoir, but it moves a lot. There's quite a bit of back and forth of carbon from the, kind of like in the air, right? Where animals and plants constantly using the CO2, breathing it. In the example on land, it was going back and forth 500 times. So the same thing's happening in the ocean, where the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, and the tuna and everything else are exchanging, CO2 with the CO2 that's dissolved in the ocean. So there's a respiration process as well. But a lower number, so more like 39 gigatons. So think for a moment about what is going to balance. So the marine biota isn't balanced at this point. So think for a moment back. What process are we going to add next here to balance that? And it's it's the biological pump. So the biological pump is sending around 11 gigatons per year of carbon down. Into the deep ocean. And there's a lot more water in the deep ocean compared to the shallow area where the light can penetrate. So we're looking at 37,000 gigatons of carbon down there. Let's continue this arrow all the way. And then we have these processes that we talked about of upwelling and downwelling. So upwelling, really bad at drawing those little things. Upwelling sends up about 101 gigatons per year. And deep water formation sends about 90.2 gigatons of carbon down. So there's two major ways that carbon moves down, the biological pump, but water just getting dense and sinking is almost 10 times as important. And then this point, if we add these up, you'll see that there's 0.2 carbon that isn't accounted for, and so that goes into sediments. So relative to these other processes, it's not a very big number. However, over time, that adds up considerably. And we'll talk about the longer term carbon cycle in a future lecture. And the other thing that we're not seeing here is the component of carbon that's carried into the ocean by rivers. So that's the connection. That's one of the connections with the last lecture, around 0.8 gigatons per year. So the connections with the last lecture, of course, the atmosphere. We had a whole different diagram that was arrows coming in and out of the atmosphere related to land, and then we sent some carbon off in the rivers. So that's where we're interacting with the land. And before we go to the slides here, I missed an important aspect of the inorganic carbon cycle. So let's continue that. Continued. Okay, but I'll just say one more thing about this diagram. Of course, it'd be worthwhile checking these numbers, adding up all of the fluxes in, seeing if they balance the fluxes out. For different purposes. One is we could use those to calculate the residence times. So, for example, for the shallow ocean, the residence time, we would sum up all of the fluxes in. We divide the stock, the 900 gigatons, by, in this case, 101 plus 39 would be 140, plus 70 would be 210, 210.8, and then we would gigatons per year. So that's just kind of a way of checking our work and getting an idea how long the carbon stays in any one particular place. Okay, so what I wanted to say about the inorganic carbon cycle and somehow missed it was the chemical reaction. So what happens when the CO2 gets in the water? It doesn't just all stay carbon dioxide. In fact, most of it doesn't. Chemical reactions occur, and we form things like carbonic acid. And the carbonic acid exists as a hydrogen ion plus another compound, the bicarbonate ion. And that can break down as well into another hydrogen and a carbonate. This is a carbonate ion. So this is the ion that will bond with the calcium dissolved in the water to form shells. But the one of the important things here is that so adding or dissolving CO2 in the water adds these hydrogen ions. In other words, it increases acidity. Right. So you've heard of the pH scale, right? The acidity scale. So that's we're adding these H ions, we're making things more acidic. But I want to be very clear: the ocean has the basic. It's not acidic chemistry. It's just doing this increases the acidity, so it makes it more in the direction of being an acid. I mean, if we dissolved enough CO2, it could make it acidic. But it is actually basic. It's just becoming less basic the more CO2 that gets added to it. Which is not to say that it doesn't make it any less of a problem. This is actually a major problem as anthropogenic CO2 is added to the water. The ocean water is getting we may come back to this as well. Ocean water, or let's just say ocean acidification is a major concern. Because it affects the environment of, like a lot of shelled organisms can't actually survive when it gets more acidic. This acidity dissolves their shells. So there's places like they're actually I think oysters in the Pacific Northwest, they can't, the young oyster shells are dissolving depending on the fluctuations in the acidity. So it's definitely a concern, and I think we'll watch a video about this later in the semester. But in terms of like the food chain and major changes in that, if the chemistry of the ocean water changes much more than it already has. So I want to end with a couple slides here. So this is a computer model of CO2 that humans have added to the water. So releasing the CO2 into the air, and the main thing I want to point out is how the greatest concentrations are in the North Atlantic here, because of the downwelling that I mentioned is the major source of this downwelling, or location where it's happening being the North Atlantic. So what you're seeing is that the ocean is right, so the upwelling is going to be more in the equator. So there's kind of this it's like basically a time bomb. CO2 entering the water, downwelling, carrying it down into the deep water, and then it's kind of slowly moving south. And it's moving. The ocean circulations have sort of 100 to 1,000 year time scales. So for the moment, the ocean is absorbing the CO2 but not releasing much. But eventually when this water starts to upwell, there will be more of a balance of the CO2 in the ocean versus the atmosphere. And the ocean will be able to absorb less, and also we'll start putting it back into the air. It's not something we have to worry about anytime soon, but several hundred years to 1,000 years later or beyond now, it's going to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere. And then I wanted to show some pictures of the plankton we talked about. So these are just kind of pretty pictures. I don't know too much about phytoplankton, but these are the organisms that are the floating plants in the ocean that create more of the oxygen we breathe than anything else. These are pictures looking through microscopes at a wide variety of different phytoplankton. I think there's one more. And then the zooplankton look more like this. They're just little creatures. Some of them have eyeballs. A lot of them are transparent. They're very tiny, microscopic things that are eating the phytoplankton and each other. And then I'll end with these. Copepods are pretty common little critters you can see in abundance in ocean water.